Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our discussion on social mobility. I'm Eoin Canty, a director here at BIE, and also our ED&I lead. We began hosting these webinars when the onset of COVID coincided with Black Lives Matter coming to the fore a few years ago, and we knew that our BIE community wanted to learn more about what they could do in their businesses from a broad inclusion perspective. This is now our 8th large-scale ED&I event, with the most recent last October being on inclusion in its broadest sense. For those of you who don't know BIE, we're an executive recruitment firm that builds leadership and enables change through a combination of executive search, interim management, and transformation expertise across 5 broad market functions. ED&I is also a huge focus for us at BIE, so we're delighted to be able to host this discussion for you today. Our panel will build on previous social mobility webinars that we've hosted to enable us to understand how the conversation has evolved and also what we can do to improve social mobility in our businesses. If we think that the Social Mobility Commission says that the most common way of looking at social mobility is by comparing your position now with the occupation of your main household earner when you were aged about 14, and we'll sort of come into this in our conversations. Today's panelists come from diverse backgrounds and experiences, and we'll be sharing some fascinating, informative, and inspiring stories from their organizations. Our discussion will last around 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions from the audience. And do submit your questions at any time during the conversation using the Q&A function here in the Zoom webinar. This session is being recorded, and we'll share a write-up with you afterwards, along with some key themes and tips for creating a more inclusive workplace. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our guests now to introduce themselves. Catherine, could I go to you first?
For sure. Thank you so much for having me today for such a topic that I'm so personally passionate about, and also represent an organisation that is so passionate about social mobility. So my name is Catherine Hearn. I'm at the PXT, which is People Experience and Technology Director at Amazon, and responsible for the UK from an employee experience perspective. So very much diversity, equity, inclusion is a key part of my role when we're considering the employee experience. Been at Amazon for about 4 years. I joined in COVID, which was an interesting experience. And I also previously came from very organizations that were very interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, which is where I first met Nick when I was at the BBC. And we were starting just then to start the conversation around social mobility. So I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Catherine. Nick.
Equally delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation this afternoon. I'm Nick Miller. I'm Chief Executive at the Bridge Group, and we're a not-for-profit that's been researching and advising on inclusion and diversity with a strong focus on socio-economic background. And Catherine's mentioned 2 of the illustrious organisations we've had the great chance to partner with. But we have, during that decade, worked with a many diverse range of firms, including with consortia groups in sectors like financial services, accountancy, and the law. And really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks both. A couple of years ago, when we started talking about social mobility, one of our participants, Sarah Atkinson, the CEO of the Social Mobility Foundation, she was telling us at the time that socioeconomic background can be measured, whereas social class can be a little bit more subjective. And for instance, some people might still feel sort of working class, even though that doesn't quite map onto their socioeconomic background. With measuring socioeconomic background being a more inclusive way of approaching the topic, we now have that as a question that we ask all candidates who participate in our searches to complete as part of our diversity monitoring form. And I thought it'd be interesting today as well, just to get a bit of audience participation as well. We have a question on Slido. So if you just go to slido.com and enter in the hashtag BIE, or I've also put a little link in the chat there as well. But it's just a very quick question. And I'd just like to know how many of you are actually collecting data on social mobility in your businesses at the moment? I think it'd be interesting for us to sort of hear how it's being reflected out there in the broader market. Nick, if I could turn to you first. You mentioned there you've worked with Catherine for quite a bit of time. You mentioned a little bit about the Bridge Group as well. But from your perspective, what are we talking about here around social equality, and sort of why are we talking about it? Why is it so important?
Yeah, and I think lots of the language used in this space lacks some precision. So I think that's a helpful first question. So what are we talking about? I suppose at its most basic level, when we talk about social mobility, we're measuring the strength of the link between a person's childhood circumstances and their adult outcomes. So to what extent are those two things linked? And to what extent are people free to move between different socioeconomic groups as well within their own lifetime? And often we talk about that between generations. And the short answer is that this topic has become one of the most pressing policy matters of our time. The UK is a highly unequal society, and that link, as I was mentioning earlier, between the circumstances into which we are born and our adult outcomes is stronger here in the UK compared with almost any other developed country. And you have to work pretty hard as a society to stay bottom of that league table. But what we're talking about here, I think, is related to social mobility, but is not the same thing. At the Bridge Group, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion with respect to socioeconomic background, just as many firms have rightly been doing so for many years around protected characteristics like gender or ethnicity. So we see many employers now considering this aspect of diversity much more seriously in their hiring processes, in promotion, and in retaining talent as well. I think you also asked me why it's important. So that's a bit of context about what we're talking about. I guess it's important at a sort of macro level. So we know from many decades of research that higher overall levels of social mobility impact positively on our economy, our health, and the sort of cultural fabric of our society. There's a wonderful book by one of our colleagues, Kate Pickett, called The Spirit Level, which I commend to people, which looks at the relationship between social mobility and all of these sort of macro economic and societal issues. At the organizational level, we know that socioeconomic background, diversity, and inclusion obviously affects who feels included in the workplace. It affects well-being, and it affects the ability to access diverse talent as well. And I might just finish with a final paragraph to say that much of the research that we've undertaken at the Bridge Group demonstrates that socioeconomic background actually has a stronger effect on access to a profession, on pay and progression, compared with some protected characteristics like gender and ethnicity. Now, we're not sort of endorsing sort of diversity top trumps. No area is more important than the other. But I do think our evidence says that if we don't look at socioeconomic background as part of this, we miss a vital aspect of the jigsaw.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you've sort of built a little bit of the context there quite nicely for us. Catherine, I know you've worked with Nick as well,
Yeah.
and perhaps we'll come to some of that. But at Amazon, a business that I'm sure most people here today will at least have some sort of affinity with, do you have a social mobility strategy?
Yes, we do. So it was something that became quite evident to us. It's actually one of our people priorities, and as Nick's alluded to, there is a strong business case for that with the future of work. So poised to shift significantly, it's really vital that we hire people who are able to kind of adapt to new systems and new ways in thinking. And I think we have, lots of organizations have a kind of outdated way of assessing people through either degrees or through very narrow lenses. And actually, for us, in order to make the shift, we really wanted to put social mobility at the heart of our strategy, and think about it in a different way, rather than thinking about it from just a kind of just the diversity element of it. We wanted to make it part of our business strategy and our people strategy. So we think about it very much at a leadership level, which I think is incredibly important, but also through the lens of our entire employee experience. So In terms of the strategy that we have in place, I think it's developed, right? Like, we only launched it in 2022, so we are early to the game, but we've learned a lot along the way. And I think as we refine it, we've become kind of clear about what for us as a business we need to focus on. And the first one is data, because without that baseline of social mobility data across our employees and also our candidates, it's really difficult to identify where we need to put our effort and where we need to really scale initiatives to address issues. The other one is the employment opportunities, as Nick was mentioning, and that employee experience, like widening access to learning and employment opportunities. That's very much part of our continuous efforts and our strategy. And then the third one is advocacy. So we believe that because of the size and scale that Amazon is, we have a responsibility to really think about the role that we play, and actually employers have a big role to play in social mobility, and we think there's real opportunity, particularly in retail, logistics and technology sectors, where social mobility has probably been more seen through financial services or more traditional consultancies. We actually believe there's huge opportunity within the industries that Amazon works in for us to really build sustainable change because of the type of gateway employers that we are. You often find that people will have their first career in retail. Often I did. I was at Woolworths in my first job. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was my first job. And I'm first generation to go to university. I kind of feel very grateful to Woolworths in terms of the way they helped me on board as an organization, and I saw a lot of value in that. But at Amazon, we've done some work around this, and just under 50% of the people that we employ are either come from either unemployed or first time out of education. That's a huge responsibility. So that's why social mobility is such a critical strategy for us.
And just interestingly there as well, you mentioned some pieces of data that you have. I think when we spoke as well a while ago initially on this topic, you were talking about how, I guess, social mobility is not captured as part of the self-identification surveys in Amazon, and that's probably the case in lots of businesses. But I guess what sort of pushed you to try and capture that information?
So Amazon is a global organization, and social mobility is very much being pushed from the UK. As Nick has said, there is real urgency around this in the UK. When you look at those indicators of social mobility, we have a prioritization. So when we're talking to this when we're looking at self-ID and protected characteristics, it is not one that is legislated for. So we haven't been able to put it on our self-ID. It's on a roadmap, but it's not being prioritized because in a global organization, there's lots of priorities. And this is one that we feel very passionately about. But actually, what we've had to do is go outside of our traditional routes and ask people to provide that self-identification data. And I think that's been actually really helpful because as again, I think has been said, social mobility is not particularly well understood in lots of people's minds. It's not so obvious as kind of other protected characteristics, and rightly isn't considered and isn't talked about in that way. So we had a lot to do to educate people about what it meant for Amazon, what it meant for us as an employer. So by going out and saying to people, we want your data, we actually had an opportunity to put together a communications campaign and say, these are the reasons why we're asking you, and this is what it means to us. And it really, the feedback from doing that helped inform our strategy. I had a very clear view of what I thought it was, and actually it's turned out to be something different, and it has evolved over time. And it came back very clearly from our employee base that social mobility shouldn't just be about progression. That should be part of it if that's what people want, for sure. But it actually should be about access to opportunities and more around equity. And so we changed some of our language by going out and talking to people about it. So yes, Ideally, it will get on that roadmap, and we will do it as part of our kind of as you onboard to the organization. It's a much easier way to do it, much less effort for sure. But we have found opportunity in going out and talking to people and saying, this is why we're collecting this data.
Yeah. I think that's interesting as well, and perhaps a question to either one of you, but when we talk about social mobility, do you think that there's a way to sort of, does it have to be just upwardly mobile social mobility, or sort of can you, if you like, progress within your band on that front?
I think it means both, and I think it's good to sort of challenge what the traditional sort of notion of social mobility is, which it got stuck in a sort of political narrative, I think, about man or woman from working class background managing to make it to be partner at a law firm. That sort of really long range social mobility, I think, particularly in the government rhetoric, we got very stuck in that. And I guess what's embedded within that assumption is that often for people to get ahead, they need to move away from where they're currently working geographically. And I think that's a dangerous narrative for many people. And to your point, I also think it comes to us just considering, the roles which we value and the value attached to particular types of work. So I think really progressing we need to have a more nuanced view on progression compared with that sort of dominant political narrative. The other aspect of this, which I find really interesting as well, is that lots of firms we speak to, and certainly the ones that Catherine has been involved at, there's been a shift in the sort of narrative away from the deficit model. So that a shift away from, there's something, I'll use direct language for effect, there's something wrong with these people from working class backgrounds. We need to do something to them to make them more look and feel a bit more like the dominant group. I think many firms now are articulating this around the sort of diversity dividend. What do you get that's unique from that sort of population? And how can we benefit from that as a firm? And then I would also say we've been very reluctant, and particularly politicians have been very reluctant to talk about downward social mobility as well. And I think it's important we discuss this, because when we think about how many partners there are at KPMG or how many students there are at Oxford University, it is a zero-sum game. So if we're encouraging more people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in, they are displacing other people from other backgrounds. And I think a fascinating trend that we've observed in lots of our work is that where there are increases in the proportion of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in education, in the workplace, the people they're displacing tend to be people in the sort of intermediate group. So some of teachers, for example, rather than displacing those people from a sort of higher socioeconomic background. So that dynamic, I think, is also to understand, helpful to understand in the workplace.
Yeah, and I suppose just sort of bringing that back into the workplace then as well. I think, Catherine, you were talking with us before about that, do you need to, let's say in a large organization like yours, do you need to, as it were, move out to move up? Do you have to move to the big city? Sort of, how do you work that, let's say in an organization like Amazon, to give people that opportunity to progress without having to necessarily, let's say, come to London?
Yes, so I think that's a big part of our kind of social mobility strategy, is around a location of work and access to opportunity. And again, I think you have to be very intentional about it. We've certainly found that there has previously been this sense of you have to move, and people who are more affluent are more able to move, right? So again, you see those people moving towards professional careers because they have access to opportunity, be that the financial support in order to kick their career off in London. And so we have been working through, how do we build up our other offices so that there is equal access to a career progression? So it shouldn't just be stuck at entry level. People can move if they want to. Like, again, there isn't, this needs to be about choice, but actually allowing us to think about reskilling in key hubs, in key areas, in order to build up tech locations, for example, has been a real opportunity for us to move things outside of London. And that's actually been really helpful as we want to, as Nick says, the opportunity for us is around cognitive diversity. And if you continue to hire the same people from the same places, there's evidence that you can track people back to actually even the same university professor that they were all taught by, and really what we're trying to do is solve for our customers, and to do that our customer base is wide and diverse, and we need an employee base who are bringing that cognitive diversity, thinking about things in a different way. So it's our job to ensure they have the skills they need, and that there is access to opportunity across different locations. But that move out in order to move up has been something that I have seen a generational shift from. My parents definitely that they left Ireland to come to London in order for access to opportunity. I stayed in London for access to opportunity, but I now see much more intentional locational strategies from organizations who are thinking about talent and where they are, finding them where they are. And that's going to have to continue as we, move, there's still a very, we're walking into all sorts of workforce demographics that mean that we are really going to have to start thinking intentionally about how we upskill our workforce. And that can be done from lots of different locations. So again, as a retailer and as a retail industry and logistics industries, technology industries, I think we have huge opportunity to do that. And we've seen organizations really, like the Co-op have really advocated for this and are doing great work in ensuring there's access to opportunity across the UK.
Yeah, I just build on that briefly. I think the geographic mobility piece is deeply important. I think another layer of that is about entry points into an organization as well. And something we've become very interested in, given the increase in degree apprenticeships, is the extent to which apprenticeships offer more accessible routes into a workplace, but equally importantly, that they offer the same sort of parity of progression compared with other entry routes as well. But maybe we'll come on to this topic in a bit more detail later.
Yeah, and just sort of even little bit linked to that, and sort of entry points in, and it's a question I'm just seeing coming in through from Debbie. She's curious as to whether you're seeing, particularly to you, Nick, are you seeing sort of people coming in or organizations choosing to offer roles maybe to unemployed candidates versus those in role already, when they do have a commitment to social mobility, and to see if, both people can do the job well. And in a way, sort of linked to that as well, was something I was thinking about is, does socioeconomic background sort of continue to have a lasting impact long into people's careers after you get past that sort of first point? And it's sort of a link back to that entry point as well, really.
Yeah, on the first question around appointing people, I'm not sure if the question was about people who are in unemployment or whether they're employed elsewhere, but I think it was.
Well, yeah, I think she was sort of specifically thinking about, to unemployed candidates. Yeah.
Yeah, I see a bit of that, but probably not enough. And I think there are two things to highlight there. One is about sort of risk appetite for risk. So I think some employers see hiring unemployed people as a higher risk option. And I think that needs to be balanced. But it speaks to this point that I think will punctuate lots of this discussion, which is about having sort of specificity around talent and what you're looking for. That is the guiding light here. What are we really looking for, and what matters much less? And then we can treat candidates on a sort of level playing field. On your question about, does socioeconomic background affect people throughout their careers? I think even 3 years ago, we would say we don't know the answer to that. But after the progression analysis that we've been doing across sectors, it's really evident that those people who progress most quickly are those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's particularly the case that it's women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who tend to progress most slowly. There's some really interesting data on this topic that I'm happy to sort of share as we begin to discuss this.
Yeah. Interesting as well, and I suppose just linked to that and back to some of our previous discussions, Nick, is there also, and I suppose this is where data can be the real sort of unlocker to some of this discussion, but is there also data that's, that talks to the progression of people from a lower socioeconomic background once they actually, let's say, manage to cross the hurdle and get into those businesses? How do they progress when they do get in?
Yeah, and this is work that we've undertaken across different sectors, not least at the BBC, but also in the law, in accountancy. It's not yet been done in retail. So I'll maybe just aggregate some of those kind of findings and share them back. what we discover is the following, that early career progression is fairly equal by socioeconomic background. So that's to say people from higher and lower socioeconomic backgrounds progress typically at relatively similar rates. It's once people get into sort of middle management where we see in those sectors I've mentioned, people from a higher socioeconomic background progressing more quickly. And it's then the case that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who make it into senior positions then progress to some of the most senior positions more quickly. So it's around this sort of middle management area where we see socioeconomic background having a really significant effect. And that tends to be, this varies by profession, the moment at which technical skills matter less, those things that you can assess more objectively, and these sort of things we might call softer skills matter more. So we find that when we look at what are the attributes that help people get ahead mid-career, it's the case that many of those attributes have little to do with job performance and are more available to people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So that includes things like being able to draw on social and alumni networks, old school networks. It also relates to the way in which people can feel confident and express that. And this might be captured in the slightly fudgy word gravitas, who shows gravitas at work? And I think we have to understand that things like confidence and gravitas are contextual, right? We tend to exhibit those things much more freely in cultures where we feel comfortable. And so if that feels more alien to us, if we're working with people who feel dissimilar, clearly it's much harder to exhibit gravitas and confidence. So we see there, again, it comes back to my earlier point, where we can have greater degrees of specificity about talent, that really matters here. So what does it mean to be a really good management consultant or a really good team leader in the retail context, and being precise about that and being clear what doesn't matter?
I think it's also really important to be able to talk about that as an organizational challenge. And I think it's something that we have started to do at Amazon only through, it wasn't when we went out as a leadership group and said, look, everyone, we're focusing on social mobility. Isn't this great? It was actually through, we started an employee resource group based around social mobility. And it was through that group and people starting to understand that they had that opportunity to really network in that group. So it's about, we call it ESME, it's Empowering Social Mobility Everywhere. And we started to talk about employee stories. And it isn't about, as Nick has said, that person from the shop floor going to CEO. It's actually about the building internal networks and starting to support through even just understanding etiquette. I remember going to a kind of partner dinner and not knowing what knife to pick up, like things like that you need to understand, that just come naturally to some people, that can be very othering if you are that person. To be able to talk about that in a work context really helps, because it's not just about the social stuff, it's about like how does promotion work here, what does progression look like, where is the soft power? And so I think for us, we found that very hugely empowering for our employees was to build that social group.
And I suppose just even on that, Catherine, from the businesses that you've worked in, and perhaps as well for Nick, for you as well, but is lower socioeconomic background, is it often hidden, or can it be hidden in organizations?
Yes is a short answer. We find across our research really strong evidence for this. People feeling sort of either their social background is hard to talk about, or that it feels kind of unnecessary. And we know from our research that people are exceptionally good at assimilating themselves to the dominant culture, but that comes at a cost. We also hear from lots of people who talk about the fact that can be exhausting, can distract them from performing as well as they would like to, and can be very dislocating coming into environments. I'll share a quote with you from one of the interviewees who shared their views with us. And he was talking about the fact that in progressing in the law profession, he didn't feel really part of that culture, but now he didn't feel part of his sort of working class culture either, because he dislocated himself from that. So I think those sorts of dynamics are really important for us to be able to explore. I would also say this is one of the reasons why collecting the data is so important. I think, Catherine, you referenced this earlier, but in asking people for this data, it provokes a discussion about why we should be wanting to know that and what will we do with that data. And I think it helps provoke a relatively healthy discussion then about what socioeconomic background means and how it affects people's experiences in the workplace. And I would also say that in this context, of course, as ever, role models can be really important and powerful. Although I do think it's just as powerful, it's important that we have senior leaders who are from a lower socioeconomic background talking about their journeys. But I would also say it's equally important that we have leaders from a higher socioeconomic background talking about the benefits of working with a more diverse group of people. So I think this is a tricky topic. It's rather contradictory. I think that in the UK, we're obsessed with class, but we're deeply reluctant to talk about it as it relates to the workplace.
Mm. And just even on that as well, and I think, Catherine, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, Amazon obviously is a large international organization, but how do you push out the social mobility conversation beyond the UK's borders? And are you seeing sort of international colleagues, are they as interested in the topic or even talking about it at all?
So it not so much. I mean, just being that it very much feels like it's a push from the UK, but actually, what I found is that I've been talking about social mobility for years. I just didn't realize it. And I think we've now badged social mobility to the point where it's almost again becoming not nuanced enough. And I think Nick was talking about earlier that we really need to think this as kind of as broadly as important to the organization. So at Amazon, what I've realized is that by going and talking to colleagues outside of the UK, particularly in the US, but Europe and Asia as well, is that we talk about access to opportunity, because that's what's so important to us. And whilst it is, we can point to the predictors of social economic outcomes and through education, we believe that employers have a really important role to play as well. It's not just government and education. And if we talk about that more around an access to opportunity rather than labeling something social mobility, it's really, we have been able to engage people to the extent that people should have the same chance to do well in life regardless of their background. In our case, we're looking at this through a socio-economic lens, but actually we highlight the intersectionality opportunity. So we very much adopt an intersectionality approach to social mobility. So if you are less advantaged in social economic status, you're much more likely to be one from another marginalized group as well. Mm-hmm. And it can lead to all sorts of compounding forms of disadvantage. And so actually, by looking at social mobility, we're able to impact more broadly and again, talk about inclusion and equity rather than those diverse characteristics. And we found that's actually created some really interesting dialogue. So if anyone is listening is in a global organization, I'm very happy to talk through the pain I went through of going out and trying to explain what social mobility meant to people, my counterparts in other geos. But actually, we are all looking for access to opportunity for people, and when you make it clear for people that's what we're trying to do, it became a much easier conversation. I think there is more to be done around the topic of internationalization of this, and Nick, I'm sure you're working on this. I think because it's difficult to collect data and do things differently. So it's easier for the UK in that sense.
Yeah. And just even as well, Catherine, when you talk about the intersectionality there with social mobility often intersecting with certainly one or often even maybe more of the protected characteristics, was there a sort of a hierarchy of voices as to which group from a broad ED&I perspective was, I guess, getting the microphone in Amazon, or did you witness any, competing competing thoughts on
certainly
that?
found that there are different narratives based in different geos, for sure. And I think, again, that people don't want that. I think people want to recognize difference and celebrate difference, but also support people through equity. So not everyone is one single diversity characteristic. And so I think that opportunity to think about intersectionality was incredibly helpful. Whereas I would say 4 or 5 years ago, certainly it was more around kind of, this is the diversity topic for this month, this is what we will talk about. And actually, you don't want to just talk about Pride or Black Lives Matter, whatever it happens to be that month. It should be running throughout your entire narrative. And so we believe in the UK, social mobility has allowed us to really access that broader dialogue without excluding, but bringing people through. And as I say, kind of recognizing those other key moments, but creating a strong narrative throughout.
And I don't know if either of you, or perhaps Nick as well, on the data side of things, can there be almost a multiplier, let's say, if you are from a lower socioeconomic background, but perhaps then ultimately, fall into one or other of the protected characteristics as well? Is there a multiplier in that?
Yeah, I think we're beginning to understand more about this in the data. So I mentioned earlier that in our work, there are really strong relationships between socioeconomic background and gender, and socioeconomic background and race and ethnicity. So we know, for example, and these are not value judgments, they're born out of the data, that if you're a person of Black heritage, you're much more likely to be from a lower socioeconomic background. The population data tells us that. We're also beginning to understand, sort of in general terms, the way in which being from a lower socioeconomic background has a stronger effect if you're a woman compared with if you are a man. And there's some fascinating qualitative work here as well, that it generally says that men find it easier to use working class roots as an asset in the workplace compared with women. Now, there'll be many exceptions to that, but across the qualitative data, we hear that narrative over and over again from interviewees. So I think if we understand these sort of relationships, and as Catherine says, we don't experience our diversity characteristics in isolation, do we? The more we can benefit from supporting people in the workplace. I think the employee networks, the sort of resource networks, often sort of isolate diversity characteristics, which is helpful in one respect, because of course, there are unique challenges and opportunities associated with lots of these characteristics. But I do think socioeconomic background is a sort of thread through them all, actually. And it's helpful to view it that way, I think, as opposed to saying, goodness, here's another diversity strand that we've got to be debating. I think the former is a much more healthy way to think about it.
And just sort of looking as well at some of the questions that are coming in here on the Q&A already, and some of them are sort of linking in with the conversation. But I think Trevor was asking around, what are employers doing, perhaps like in the case of Amazon, around getting some of these people, perhaps people from a lower socioeconomic background. How do you engage with them in the first instance to get them knowing about your business, and I guess knowing about the types of roles that can be there? I think what he's saying is that sometimes people, perhaps from a lower socioeconomic background, might feel intimidated, for want of a better word, about, let's say, approaching, a prestigious international organization like Amazon. How do you go out and engage to try and get those people to come to you?
For sure. I mean, I totally. That's a question I task myself with pretty much every day, to think about that, because I do believe that you need to meet people where they are rather than expecting them to come to you. I think that's a very old-fashioned way of thinking about things. But actually, what we have done is specifically we spent a a lot of our kind of recent period focusing on apprenticeships, and Nick has already referenced apprenticeships as a fantastic route, but they do need to lead to careers and progression. Like, they can't just be the tool that trains and then people go off into a different workforce. So we've been really working on that career progression and ensuring that the apprenticeships that we have are the ones for the skills for the future. So looking at that strategic workforce plan, what is the skills that we're going to need, and therefore building our apprenticeships around those. We've been incredibly successful. I think Amazon is one of the biggest employers with apprenticeships, and I'm really proud of all that work. But it's not a silver bullet. Like, it is not the social mobility tool. We are definitely seeing the value of higher education being questioned by people from middle class and even upper class, in terms of saying, is that the route for me? Is an apprenticeship the route for me? So if people are thinking apprenticeships are the route for social mobility, it isn't necessarily the case. So you have to be even more intentional, and what we're doing is focusing more on T-levels and work experience. That's really what we're trying to do now, to start to familiarize people with the culture of work and representing them. And we talk about our inclusion as being either bolt on or built in, and you have to create pathways for people, bolt on career pathways for people. So we work with prison leavers, and we have a jobs program with Bernardo's. We have lots of those bolt-on programs, because actually you need to help people access that opportunity, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. For sure, it would be great if every recruitment process was open and equal to everyone, but it's not always the case. You may need to bring people back into the workforce in a different way. So, for example, we piloted a returners program for women focused around social economic diversity, and we had a 16-week project, and then the interview was at the end. So you got to understand Amazon's way of working and terminology, because I think these organizations can be opaque, and access to technology to understand how to run to even go into an interview can be a barrier for people. So I think for us, it's about meeting people where they are, finding what is how can we help support, but it's a lot of work. But it's important work, and I think that's why we goal ourselves and task ourselves in order to do that.
And I would add, Catherine, to your helpful comments that that needs to start early too, right? I think employers increasingly are going out into communities with schools, for example, talking about careers. I mean, our careers, information, advice and guidance funding in the school sector has been decimated. I'm not suggesting employers have to kind of fill that gap, but I think for lots of these young people, meeting people in firms is such an important contact. And to your point about degrees, we have a higher education system that is world-class at three things: teaching, research, and sorting people by socioeconomic background. And I think if we're using degree, or even degree at particular university, as a proxy for talent, I think firms have to also understand they're sorting people by socioeconomic background by using those proxies as well.
Yeah, and probably just even going back a step before that as well. I think it's a question that Juris is asking as well, about how important is access to education, I guess, and sort of measuring that equal education opportunity, I suppose, before somebody ultimately gets to even apply for a job.
Yeah, where to start with that? Let's try and solve it in 16 minutes. As we've described, yeah, our education system is deeply unequal. It has many world-class traits, as well as I described earlier. And I guess as an employer, you could easily say, well, in a sense, it's the pipeline that's the problem. That bit is broken. But I also believe two things. Employers have a really important role to play in supporting the education of young people, and I know organizations like Amazon do. But secondly, also employers create their own barriers. We know that. So we know, for example, with employers, when we control for pretty much any other factor, including prior attainment, institution attended, A-level grades, etc., applicants from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are disproportionately not hired in organizations. So even when we control for what's happened in the education system, And that has to do, I'm sure, with, again, sort of proxies of talent being used, employers using proxies that are, not particularly related to job performance, but map wonderfully onto socioeconomic background.
And it's a question coming through from Veronica as well, Nick, or perhaps to Catherine as well, but on that point, is there a connection between, I suppose, what could be termed an imposter syndrome as well, and people's socioeconomic background? Is there something there that's saying that they're saying, oh my gosh, I don't feel I'm up for this?
Yeah, I think in our qualitative research, there's a really intimate connection between imposter syndrome and socioeconomic background. And we often talk to employers about sort of, what's the task at hand here, as I referenced earlier? Is it to help people with a deficit of something learn to fit in better? Or is it about challenging some of these dominant work cultures? And without sort of sounding too grand, those dominant work cultures have often been created over many, many centuries or decades by affluent white men. So I think we have to kind of go back to having this specificity about talent, what it means to be really effective in your job, and what matters much less. As I said earlier, we hear interviewees talking about the energy expended to try and assimilate into these sort of dominant cultures. It's a really important factor.
Yeah. And I guess, Catherine, have you seen in Amazon or even sort of elsewhere that you take, I suppose, effectively sort of contextualize or take people's backgrounds into account when assessing applications or applicants in any way?
So, like lots of organizations, that there has been in the past a kind of that sense of as Nick has said, that degree being as a proxy for success, but we are moving away from that for sure. I think as an organization, abilities and aptitude are far more crucial, and that we believe is that ability to learn. And there's so little research that demonstrates the correlation between years of education and job performance. I think it's something like 0.1% is the current thinking, that actually the correlation between cognitive ability and skills is so much stronger around how well you will perform in your role, that actually those are the ways that we're looking to evaluate skills. And to Nick's point, be really clear about what those skills are. And so moving away from kind of those educational requirements, or even years of experience, which we still see a lot of in terms of in job adverts, that you really need to start to rethink that. And I think, again, as an industry, collectively, we can do much more around that, and celebrate the success of organizations that are doing that. Because it's a really tight labor market out there. And as I say, with workforce demographics, we are going to be going into increasingly more challenging waters, and we will need to retain and recruit older workers. And again, I think that sense of what success looks like will continue to need to evolve. But for me, the growing focus on equity commitments has really led to that questioning of just common practices that seem to have happened over the last 20 years, which we've seen much more degree requirements come in over that time period for every job, regardless of whether they're required. And also what Nick has kind of helped open my eyes to is job polarization, which is where you see people with very high skilled work and then low skilled work, and the opportunity to progress between the two as not there's just not there as it used to be, with longer term careers and people to able to move. That job polarization that's happened over the last 20 years, I think, is pretty important for us all to recognize. And that means that we are going to have to look at those competencies rather than, have you done this for 20 years and can you replicate it in the same way in my organization? So it's not just a nice to do, it's actually business critical, and driven by those, as I say, those workforce demographics that we're facing into.
Brilliant. Nick, is there, everybody talks a lot these days about AI, and what it can do for us, but Is there anything that you've seen from the AI perspective at the moment as to how that can shape the social mobility conversation at all?
Yeah, maybe two reflections. One builds on Catherine's comments there. I mean, it's more about the sort of shape of the labour market than the way in which we might use AI in recruitment, because as Catherine was alluding to, lots of those sort of rungs on the ladder have been removed in terms of progression. So I think AI is really affecting some of those sort of intermediate jobs rather than the high-skilled jobs or the sort of low-skilled jobs. So I think that hollowing out of the middle means that there are fewer rungs on the ladder to climb up. And I see that especially in retail and the work that Amazon commissioned us to do. So I think that means creating more deliberate pathways for those exceptional people who are in relatively low-skilled work but have aspirations to progress within the workforce. AI as a recruitment tool, I'm yet to see really compelling evidence that AI can contribute to working against unconscious bias rather than reinforce some of those things as well. I'm no tech expert, but of course AI learns from what has happened previously. And I think we have to be really careful about built-in biases in AI models.
And just sort of out of curiosity as well, and just sort of thinking that obviously here today we're talking about Amazon, and you mentioned BBC there as well. Many of the people attending today will be from perhaps smaller businesses, more SME type organizations. Is that something that either of you have sort of seen a different conversation on this happening in SMEs or smaller businesses? Perhaps Nick, I don't know if you've seen any of
Nick,
that.
have you got me? Sorry.
So I think with SMEs, we've talked about sort of data being the foundation of this, and I'd like to sort of echo that. With SMEs, it can be harder if you've got fewer employees and there are more intimate connections between people in the workplace. So I think their data collection is often undertaken by a third party or by a non-executive board member. However, my experience with SMEs is they're actually more dexterous in their hiring. They can introduce more innovative practices. And I've seen SMEs where their employee networks, which may be very small, collaborating with employee networks at other SMEs as well. So some of the most progressive practices I've seen in the space have been delivered by SMEs.
Yeah. I think that's probably a nice way for us to sort of think about bringing today's discussion to a close as well, and just even linking back to the data, just looking at some of the people who've replied into our little question today as well on what people are doing around who are attending here today. And it's interesting, I think probably a lot of people are relatively early on some of their journey talking around social mobility and thinking about it, and that's probably reflected as well. I think it's only 1/3 of the people today are actually currently collecting data on social mobility in their businesses, but perhaps it's something for us all to start sort of edging away at and getting that data in to be able to really think about it. Well, look, on that point, I'd perhaps like maybe to ask Catherine and Nick if there's one key piece of advice that you would give to the audience here today for them to think about progressing social mobility or the topic of social mobility in their businesses. Catherine, do you have any thoughts on that? A little nugget of advice.
Yeah, I think the voice of the employee is incredibly important here. I genuinely believe that we changed our strategy based on the feedback that we got from our employees. It's very easy to take. There's lots of great work out there for people talking about social mobility, but actually it needs to really resonate with your employee base. Otherwise, it just feels like an add-on or an addition. So I would really go and talk to your employees about what it means for them. I found that so empowering, so educating for me, and as I say, this is something that I feel is personal to me, but actually I learned so much by going and talking to people, and we've actually now taken the opportunity to build a future leader board for our current leadership board to get them to think about this more deeply, to bring that different cognitive diversity to them so they get access to the employee voice much more consistently around the topic. So that's my key learning is even though working with brilliant people like Nick and reading all of this actually academic material, go talk to your employees. It's so important.
Thanks, Catherine. Nick, what do you think?
I certainly agree with that point, Catherine. I think the data is really fundamental, but there's so much you can do without the data as well. I think there's a risk we sort of cultivate a narrative that says until we've got the data, we really can't act, and that's unhelpful. I would say briefly, this is about performance as well. One of the conclusions we could draw from these unequal progression rates is that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't perform as well. There's no evidence to suggest that's the case. In fact, in some of our research, we see in the law, for example, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds outperforming their peers from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. And then the last thing I would say is that we work a lot with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, helping them navigate the workplace. But I think it's just as important to be enlightening sort of the dominant group as well. And I don't just mean white men, but I do mean white men from affluent backgrounds about the importance of this topic and what the evidence suggests. So that's my final word. Thank you.
Yeah. Brilliant, brilliant. Well, look, it just leaves me, I guess, at this juncture to thank you both for your time today. And I think a lot of interesting perspectives shared in, and hopefully it's enlightened, many of our attendees as well. I really hope that you, the BIE community, got a lot out of today's discussion. I've certainly benefited, I think, as well. But the broad topic of social mobility is definitely one that we're keen to continue here. So do let me know if there are other angles in on this topic that you'd like us to explore in the future. I would ask you all, I know Catherine mentioned as well, I think sort of the Social Mobility Foundation's Employer Index, which Amazon is up there in lights on, but the nominations for that are opening in the coming weeks, along with the UK Social Mobility Awards as well. Nominations are opening in the coming weeks for that. So there are two things for you to think about perhaps getting involved in. Do also look out for Social Mobility Day on the 13th of June and perhaps think of what you can do, no matter how small, in your businesses around that. I did mention earlier that we will share a recording of today's session along with a little write-up of some of the key themes and topics for creating a more inclusive workplace in your businesses. Really looking forward to catching up again, either in this forum or else in person with some of you over the next little while. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for joining us. Bye.